Hey, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you for being here on a pretty hot, late summer kind of a day. What do we have, 2 more days of summer? But kind of unseasonably warm. It's been dry though, in terms of humidity, so its mornings have been cool, and the day length is shorter, so it's a little easier to make it through all of that. We could really use some rain in a bad way. We're extremely droughty out there, so we've been spending a lot of time watering and repairing irrigation things that we didn't need for a long time, and it was so wet earlier in the year, but we need it now for sure. So we're spending a lot of energy out there keeping things alive. I want to introduce one person here. Many of you know I'm moving into a semi-retirement phase here. I'll work in the garden all next year full time, and then in the spring of 2026 move into a part-time role. We've hired our new head of horticulture, and that's Nick Estes right over here. I'm really happy to have him here. He comes with a long history of working in public Japanese gardens in the U.S. in both Memphis and in Fort Worth. So trained by John Powell. John's a great teacher, and who has presented here numerous times and done things here in the garden. So we're really happy to have Nick here, and together with the rest of the crew, we hope to elevate the garden into the future, make it Kaizen, gradually and continually better. So we are just a few days away from the full moon. Yes, 2 days from the full moon, and it was we had our Tsukimi event here, the moon viewing ceremony, which was really beautiful for those of you who were able to attend. The moon cooperated very nicely. We had tea ceremony and ikebana, Japanese flower arrangements, really wonderful exhibition. So all that went really fabulous, with a shakuhachi being played by a tea teacher from Chicago. Really great event, and there's lots more coming too. There's all kinds of things still happening out in the garden. There's a bunch of stuff on the website, all kinds of exercise and other events. But on to tonight's program. We became familiar with the Center for East Asian Studies at UW-Madison. It's been a few years now through Professor David Fields, who's the Associate Director of the center. And we are really grateful. They've been supportive of programming here, and now a collaboration with lecture series. I presented, I think it was in April this year, up at for their lecture series, their spring lecture series, and now Professor Thal will be here tonight to give the second of those lectures from Center for East Asian Studies faculty. So just a little bit about Center for East Asian Studies. It began in 1962, and now they're building on more than 60 years of research and teaching on China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, Taiwan, and all of it at UW-Madison. It's grown from less than a dozen faculty members, teaching 30 graduate level courses, to more than 70 faculty members, teaching nearly 300 courses at both undergraduate and graduate levels. The Center for East Asian Studies is the focal point connecting East Asia to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. One of UW-Madison's 8 federally funded national resource centers, CEAS is dedicated to all aspects of research, education, and outreach related to China, Japan, and Korea. So it's amazing to have such an incredible center for studies so close and so interested in being a part of what we do here. We're super grateful for all that. And so now Professor Sarah Thal, she teaches Japanese history at UW-Madison with an emphasis on religious and intellectual history. Her first book, Rearranging the Landscape of the Gods, examines changes in a popular pilgrimage site from the 16th to the early 20th century. And so I'm super excited about this lecture tonight. I've been waiting for it for months. And so not to put not too much pressure, but really excited about it. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Sarah Thal.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, all of you, for being here. This is exciting to join you. I'm going to set this here well, no, I might decide to walk. Should have been warned. We need to warn the next person to wear something with pockets.
Noted. Right.
Okay. So, have you ever wondered why samurai in films and books and elsewhere seem so disciplined and rational? Why they seem to have some code of honor, and why we don't usually think of women as being samurai? Well, the answer lies not in some long distant past reality in Japan, but in the 1890s and early 1900s, because at a time when Japan shared in a conversation with the United States and European powers such as England and Germany, a conversation about civilization and progress and character. And it was a result of this international conversation that a few Japanese thinkers in the 1890s started talking about a way of the samurai that supposedly was some kind of description of how all samurai in the past used to behave, some innate Japanese essence of Japanese culture. And this, we think, and pop culture and a lot of our society trains us to think of some ancient Japanese identity or culture or code of honor, but it's actually from the 1890s and early 1900s. So I'm going to talk with you today about how that happened and what it meant for why we think of the way of the samurai the way we do. So, the way of the samurai is known in Japanese as bushido. Do, the last character being Dao, or the way, and bushi being the word for a warrior. The first character is military, and then she is sort of a gentleman. The word samurai, which is what we use in English, was used much less often in Japan, and it was a title for somebody who was a close servant to a lord. But usually in Japanese, people refer to members of the old military status as bushi. So bushido, the way of the samurai. And actually the way of the samurai, this word, bushido, we see no evidence of it before around 1600. And that was the beginning of the Tokugawa era. After Tokugawa Ieyasu, the shogun, won, essentially unified Japan after centuries of civil war. And one of the things that he did is that he established, well, his predecessor Hideyoshi had removed weapons and swords from most of the population so that only warriors were allowed to have swords. So there was the sword hunt. And then the Tokugawa continued this, and the Bushi were the only ones who were allowed to have swords. They had a monopoly on violence, so they were the ones who became the police, they became the enforcers, they were the rulers, they were the ruling class of the lords of all the different domains underneath the Tokugawa, and all the Bushi who worked for those lords essentially as bureaucrats and government officials for each of the separate domains. And so the word bushido, a few people, very few people, around 1600, started talking about bushido simply to say, this is what the Bushi do that's different from other people. They do government stuff. They study Confucianism or whatever. So bushido was about status, a special status of samurai. And then, I don't know whether any of you are aware of the story of the 47 Ronin. The Chushingura, this very, very prominent play based on an event from 1703, that just, has been a blockbuster for centuries at this point. And so plays, kabuki plays, puppet plays like Chushingura also portrayed an idea of a way of the samurai, or bushido, that was about loyalty, valor, revenge, avenging one's lord, and that kind of thing. And actually a lot of these pop culture type things portrayed this bushido as something weird, you know, that thing that those weird samurai do that's totally irrational. They will, you know, instead of trying to just make ends meet like a merchant or somebody else, they go off and they go fight people for no reason, just to, you know, defend their crazy honor or whatever. Because the plays were written mainly for merchant audiences. So they're depicting bushido as sort of this strange anthropological thing that's a little bit weird. So the idea of bushido really was very few people used the word. It wasn't really a thing when bushi were actually in existence. Because why would it be? I mean, this is just the elite. You know, you're not gonna generalize about the elite because they're all different, they do different things. Everybody has a different way of approaching life. Well, as I'm sure, as you know, in 1854, Japan entered the world of the international law, and with Perry and his black ships coming in and essentially strongly encouraging the shogun to sign treaties. And so Japan got pulled into the international legal system through a set of unequal treaties with the United States, England, France, the Netherlands, Russia, and more. And essentially, Japan, they didn't have control over their own tariffs. The foreign powers set the tariffs, so they didn't have control over their own trade and essentially their own economy. They didn't have control over the legal system. If any foreigner committed a crime on Japanese soil, they were tried by the foreign courts, by the consular courts, not by the Japanese courts. So the people in Japan desperately wanted to regain control over their own laws, their own economy, everything else. They were never formally colonized, but they were not equal with everybody else either. And one of the causes of the Meiji Restoration, of the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate and the formation of a centralized government with the emperor as a figurehead at the center, was to centralize government. They saw, look, these Western powers, they're really strong. They have centralized governments with national armies and that kind of thing. We need to do the same thing. And so that was one of the impetuses for the Meiji Restoration and the very fast reforms that happened afterward. So one of the very first things the Meiji oligarchs did was to send a study group and to actually send many students abroad to learn about what the Western nations did right. How did they get to be so powerful? How can we become powerful like them and be recognized as their equals? They portrayed the emperor, they took him out of his court robes and had him portrayed as a modern Western style monarch in Western style military dress. They knew that these powerful Western nation states, they weren't feudal anymore. They didn't have the clear divisions of social statuses that they did in Japan. And also for economic reasons, the Meiji government abolished samurai. The status of samurai in the 1870s, no longer. There were no more samurai. They're not allowed to carry swords anymore. They had to get their hair cut, no more top knots. I mean, there are these stories of, you know, police chasing after conservative old samurai who didn't want to cut their top knots off, grabbing them, wrestling to the ground and slashing off their top knots. And, you know, they lost their jobs because there are no more domains for them to work in, so they don't have any lords to work for. They lost their stipends, their income. So most of the samurai became totally impoverished. They had been trained that they shouldn't think about money. And they didn't, you know, they're used to just receiving a stipend, whether they did work or not. And so a lot of samurai in the 1870s, 1880s were the butt of jokes because, you know, these stupid samurai who are totally useless and could do nothing. So a bunch of samurai, you know, they would try to go, you know, cultivate, you know, cut down forest and start farming. They'd never farmed before. A bunch of them emigrated, some of them to South America or to British Columbia or whatever. So the samurai were in very bad repute. Nobody wanted to talk about samurai. People just wanted to ignore them. So of course, what happens to all these former samurai, and especially the young men who were just coming of age, who thought they were gonna be samurai, and suddenly, boom, there's nothing. Well, they started studying, many of them started studying Western thought. And in 1871, a translation of Samuel Smiles's Self-Help was the runaway bestseller, especially among these young former samurai. Apparently there are records of these students lining up overnight to get copies of Self-Help, and then again later of Samuel Smiles' book, Character, okay? And I put this here because you can't read it on that front page, but it starts off with a quote from Shakespeare, this above all to thine own self be true, right? You can see how this would appeal to a young man who no longer has a lord that he follows, right? And he's trying to figure out, what do I do to get ahead in this strange world? Okay, to my own self be true. Okay, I'll do my, rely on myself. It's all about character and conduct and perseverance and industry. Work hard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, all that kind of thing. So, on the one hand, they're getting that message. And then, also another very influential book. The way people learned world history was also through American textbooks, including, I don't know if you've ever heard of Peter Parley's History or whatever. There was in the I think it was written in the 1850s. People in America would learn from Peter Parley's history through geography about some man in a hot air balloon looking at the world from the balloon. But the thing that the best-selling American textbook in the United States and the world history textbook in the United States and Canada in the 1870s was William Swinton's Outlines of the World's History. William Swinton had been Walt Whitman's Latin tutor, and at this point he was teaching English and history at the newly founded, I forget what it was called, it's now UC Berkeley out in California. But he wrote Outlines of the World's History with special relation to the history of civilization and the progress of mankind. And this book, like many other world histories of the time, told a story about how the West became great. The narrative starts in ancient Egypt, focuses especially, two huge sections, on ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and the wonderful philosophies and culture and democracy there, and then the monarchy, which is also good and modern. And then, then there's a sort of a through line in a way, got a little blip of the Dark Ages, and then Christianity, the Crusades and chivalry created rescued Western civilization and civilized people and created, as he called it, the modern gentleman, the noblest human type the world had ever seen. So this is a narrative of Western civilization from ancient Greece and Rome with Christianity, so both about the success of nations, but also the creation of a good gentleman. And then of course the Renaissance and the modern period of industry, and there was lots of chapters on which machines were being developed and who developed them and all that kind of thing. So this is, 1870s, this is what they're interested in. And especially in Swinton's in particular, focusing not just on nations, but on races. Swinton's book, and this is the one that was also a bestseller in Japan, translated like 14 times in the 1880s, and read in English by anybody who wanted to go to college. This was probably the most racist of the bunch. I mean, very explicitly racist, explicitly said that only the Aryan race has history. It doesn't, the others, Chinese, I believe Chinese history had maybe half a sentence, and Japan is not mentioned at all. So very interesting that Japanese are learning this narrative of world civilization, Western civilization, with no mention of themselves at all. So, these young samurai, former samurai, they're learning about self-help, they're learning about Western civilization, how do you succeed as both an individual and a nation, and Japan is continuing to try to prove to the West that they are civilized, they are the equals of the West. So, for instance, the elite, the cabinet, and the leaders of the Meiji government got Western suits. They got their wives to get dressed in Western dresses. They built a building with a ballroom so they could entertain diplomats and show that they knew how to dance Western style and play Western music and be civilized. Okay. Likewise, those foreigners felt that it was how women were treated in a society was a marker of how civilized a society was. Therefore, they had to get their elite women, the wives of all these Meiji leaders, had to come out in public. They had to dress in Western style and start doing charitable things and going to lectures and going to dinner parties and all that kind of thing. Which, merchant and peasant women had been out in public, for centuries. They couldn't afford to be, hidden back somewhere without being in public. But samurai wives had often been, expected to be more private and not be wandering around in public. They should be managing their households at home. The Meiji Constitution, because you had to be a constitutional government, in this case a constitutional monarchy, in order to be equal to the West. The Meiji Constitution was conferred by the emperor in 1889, went into effect in 1890 with Japan's first national elections and the National Diet. And of course, you can't be a modern power without having an empire. So, you invade Korea, the first Sino-Japanese War. Japanese, after their very, decisive victory, expected to be able to essentially have the beginnings of an empire. The Western powers were not so thrilled, and they intervened, and they sort of made that not happen. But in 1894 and 1895 is when people really started once again talking about a way of the samurai, because a couple other people had sort of brought it up beforehand, but this was now, if you're at war, this is when it's really convenient to start saying, hey, we Japanese, we're especially strong, we have a martial tradition, we should be appreciating our way of the samurai, and we are showing our way of the samurai to the world. Okay? So there were a few people, including some sort of hawkish politicians, who started going on and on about the way of the samurai is the soul of Japan, and that kind of thing. So, it's still showing the West that Japan is an equal of the great powers and should get rid of those unequal treaties. This is still extremely important. This is still the main focus of diplomacy. The foreign minister was assassinated because he wasn't progressing as much in this regard as people had hoped. So this is still central, okay? And just to give you an example of the kind of language being used by the West about Japan, there was a very prominent Yale University professor of philosophy named George Trumbull Ladd, who, for instance, in January 1895, this is right after all Japan had a very significant victory in the war, published an article in Scribner's, the same issue as a story by Edith Wharton and something else by Edgar Allan Poe and whatever. So this is, a widely read literary magazine in the United States at the time. And he wrote about the mental characteristics of the Japanese, because he had spent 2 months there in the summer of 1892 talking to some Christian summer camps. And in this article, Ladd, who was the foremost expert on practical psychology at the time, was an expert on the study of national character or racial character, This was considered the way the essential character of a race or a nation was considered to be in their blood, to be blood-born. This was the latest scientific thinking, that it was not nurture, it was nature, it was inborn. And he said that the Japanese were frivolous, they were sentimental, they were artistic, in that they sought pleasure and beauty in gardens and the tea ceremony instead of being serious, purposeful people. His New England Congregationalist bent is showing there, right? And he went on and on about how they are a people with an impulsive will and great lack of steady, tenacious purpose. So you can see this sort of Northeast Connecticut Congregationalist approach here. And of course, you know, he spent time in Japan. A bunch of people that had hosted him a few years ago knew about this, and they very quickly got a copy of Scribner's and learned about this. And one of the people who was not happy with Ladd's characterization of Japanese was Onishi Hajime, who also happened to be Christian. He was a professor of philosophy at Tokyo College, which is now Waseda University. And he took exception to Ladd's characterization, and still writing during the Sino-Japanese War, suggested that Ladd should have looked at bushido. I agree that our people are sentimental, but I think that if Mr. Ladd had tried to understand deeply the spirit of bushido, his argument concerning the moral sense of our people would be very different, he wrote. And as a scholar of philosophy, having taught courses in Western philosophy, he said that bushido is very similar to Stoicism. So he'd been teaching courses, the textbooks in Japan at that time about Western philosophy always contrasted Stoicism with hedonism or Epicureanism. So Ladd says, Japanese are only interested in art and gardens and tea. No, 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 we are Stoics. We're the opposite of that because of bushido. And Stoicism, in 19th century view, is focused on reason, on a sense of morality that comes from within yourself. All you have to do is follow your own will, because your own will is naturally the will of heaven and earth and God, if you're a Christian. And use your willpower, and you can do anything. So therefore, it's a matter of self-discipline. You don't rely on external things, you rely on yourself. You see the similarities to self-help here, right? And one of the great appeals is that Stoicism was praised in the 19th century, especially as having given rise to the great men of ancient Rome, such as Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was a very famous Stoic, Seneca, Cato, and others. So, Onishi said, Bushido is like Stoicism, because an individual's moral sense is the foundation of the samurai's character. Samurai control themselves. They have self-discipline. They don't seek out profit or rewards. They are not religious. Instead, they are rational. This is an important point in the post-Darwin world, right? There's a little dispute about the role of religion in the world. The samurai are at peace with fate. They cultivate an immovable heart like Stoic apathy. And they don't fear death. Suicide is perfectly fine. So one of the appeals of Stoicism to these guys was that Stoics committed suicide. And given how long the missionaries had been criticizing Japan, and especially samurai traditions, for people committing ritual suicide, here was one of the foundations of Western civilization where people committed suicide and it was okay. And so, to be able to say, look, Bushido is like Stoicism. It's like your ancient Greek philosophy that's the foundation of your civilization. It's about reason, it's about self-discipline, and it's about suicide. Suicide is fine. So he could argue that Japan had its own version of the philosophical foundations of Western civilization. And of course, you know, this description of Bushido is just, of course, Onishi's view of it, right? I mean, many samurai behaved in many different ways and thought many different things, but Onishi pulled out these elements to emphasize because he wanted to present bushido as similar to Stoicism. So, Stoicism, bushido becomes compared and defined essentially as Stoicism because it's in a reaction against this lad's description of the Japanese as these sentimental, immature, undisciplined people, right? And bushido is first compared to and described in relationship to chivalry in the context of debates over whether and how much to educate women. So I mentioned before this change in women's status, more activity of women in public, especially elite women, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, more and more of the elite women were getting educated. And there was pushback against that. A lot of people were like, no, 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 the place of women is in the home. They shouldn't be out in public. They shouldn't be out, learning things and, outside of the control of their parents-in-law, that kind of thing. But in 1895, the Minister of Education, as well as one of the elder statesmen, Baron Hosokawa Junjiro, who was the headmaster of the Piers Girls' School, used the war to argue that actually educating women is important because, they espoused this idea of good wife, wise mother. If you educate women, they can be good wives to support their husbands to get along in this new world where education is important, and they can help educate the next generation of Japan's leaders, Japan's soldiers, the young men who are growing up. And so Hosokawa was very closely identified with this idea of women's education. I would like to say women's rights, but it really was about education to support them for the good of the men in their lives. So for instance, it was in the context of that he got interested in this idea of chivalry. So in May 1896, shortly after the Sino-Japanese War, he was giving a lecture to a group of alumni from his school, women, and he said, everyone knows that Westerners have a custom of revering women, but few people know the origins of that custom in the Crusades. It is said that the high position of women in civilized nations is a gift of European chivalry, and he translated chivalry as bushido. So he said it's a gift of European bushido. And a little more than a week later, he was lecturing to the Academy of Science, which is the highest academic organization in the land, and he gave a lecture on bushido, and he wanted to define it in his own terms. He said, bushido is not just bravery and fighting, which is what it was being promoted as during the Sino-Japanese War, right? This is a guy, he's 61 years old now in 1896, 1895, whatever, he's in his 60s. And he remembers he grew up before the samurai were abolished, and he knew, samurai, at least the ones he was around, they were bureaucrats, right? They were cultured men. And he said, it's not about bravery, although he said valor should be used at appropriate times, right? But copying the language from Swinton's Outlines of World History, word for word from a translation, the most popular translation at the time, he started talking about chivalry. And he was especially influenced by the section on chivalry and the development of the gentleman, the modern gentleman. And so he said chivalry, or bushido as it was translated, is manners, habits, and thoughts. It's the customs of the bushi, it's not their fighting. And customs includes both good and bad, he said. The good part of bushi customs is manners and etiquette and morality. The bad part of bushi customs is irrational violence and suicide. So, totally different viewpoint, right? So he condemned whatever didn't fit with his ideal civilized bureaucrat and educator. And he highlighted everything that was similar between his view of bushido, or the past of the bushi, and chivalry. So he went on for pages about how both Chivalry and bushido have horse riding and tournaments and armor and swords and on and on. He just started listing everything. And then he had 2.5 sentences. Well, and he continued on about, he had just a couple sentences about the differences. Pages, he said, served the lady of the great house, and in the process learned manners of docility and respect, as well as music, chess, the use of weapons, and the like. He's describing European chivalry. And he says, although the customs of the Western knights and the customs of our country's bushi are extremely similar, when it comes to the one matter of revering women, there exists something that is truly not the same. Leaving aside this one thing, the similarities are great and the difference is small. So that was it. Everything's the same, just this little thing about women, that's it. And then he went on, in the West, the institution of knights fell into ruin, yet even after hundreds of years passed, the lingering memory of its good customs remained and transformed into the gentleman. Likewise, even though the institution of bushi in our nation has fallen into ruin, its spirit should yet exist in society for a long time. I deeply hope that this spirit will continue, not pointlessly limited to soldiers, but becoming the beautiful customs of all gentlemen. So he's like, okay, we have our own chivalry. It creates our current gentlemen, us elite, former samurai who vote, okay, and hopefully lead the government. So for Hosokawa, bushido is chivalry, but chivalry without women. So, if we think of what we know of European views of chivalry, I was looking on the web for illustrations. Every illustration I could find had a knight kneeling, either to a woman or to a cross. And you don't get that image. The bushido image of chivalry is chivalry, but without women, right? Without Christianity and without women. So Hosokawa's version of bushido, his comparison of bushido and chivalry, was picked up by several people, both to continue it and to oppose it. And one of the prominent people opposing it was a man named Mikami Reiji, who wrote an essay that was included in a book that was published as part of a fundraiser for a swordsmanship school. And actually the second half of the book is a list of all the people who donated to the school, most of whom were former samurai under the Tokugawa, and a few of their, sort of networks of connections within various martial arts groups at the time. And Mikami's essay, he says, you can see that this whole story of Western civilization is foremost in his mind. He writes, there is a book called History of the World. If one reads the whole book, one can see that its world, despite being called the whole world or all nations, is only the history of the Aryan race, only the history of Christians. Those Christian countries, not paying attention to what they call civilization, what they call love, what they call justice, those Christian countries ignore the tenets of international law that they themselves established, and don't hesitate to use their merciless teeth and claws on countries of other regions, or other religions, sorry. Men of virtue of the Orient do not become better by following the morals of Westerners. So he says, Western morality, Western civilization, it's all hypocrisy. Instead, he describes Japanese bushido, his idealized version of the samurai past, as virtuous, masculine, hereditary, hierarchical, embedded within the patriarchal family and disciplinary structure of an idealized feudal era bushi society. So he goes on and on about how the most important part of civilization is hierarchy between lord and vassal, but especially husband and wife. That's for him like the central part of civilization, civilized behavior. So he goes on about those Westerners, and by extension misguided Japanese, such as Hosokawa, who forget the proper hierarchical ordering of society, including the difference between husband and wife, and who are so lacking in morality that they won't even hesitate to kill their lord or their father. he goes on to then say, of course, that any comparison between bushido and European chivalry is unfounded. He says, historians say that Western gentlemen mix with women and demonstrate refined manners. Their treatment of women, in contrast to the attitude of Oriental men towards women, is not harsh. This, historians think, is the virtuous legacy of chivalry. In particular, when knights were squires, they were almost all raised as the companions of ladies. They were trained to develop their righteousness and bravery for the sake of women. So all of this emphasis on women means that for Mikami then, this is not real virtue. What is similar, he says, what is similar between chivalry and Japan's bushido is only the outward appearance. Its spiritual marrow is extremely different. The people are of fundamentally different races, and so human emotions and customs are different. So in other words, he goes on and on about knights are soft, they are a pacifying influence on society, and they were raised to obey women, whereas bushi are disciplined military men raised to serve their lord. And he says then, he continues, if one believes that chivalry, which does not actually resemble Japan's bushido much at all, if one believes that it passed on its noble virtues to the moral principles of the West, today calling them civilization, then there can be no doubt that our bushido, which is far superior to chivalry in so many ways, can have a great effect in promoting the development of the morality of world civilization. In other words, bushido, we should spread bushido to the world. And actually some members of the Pan-Asianist, violent Pan-Asianist societies, such as the Black Dragon Society, were part of this whole circle, and with Mikami and others. So one can see this whole strand of bushido. We're going to, show true civilization to the world, starting here. Okay, so you can see how people were developing the idea of bushido with an eye toward Western civilization. And you can see this especially in the very influential work of Nitobe Nazo. And for anybody who knows any writings on bushido, they will know Nitobe's book, which he wrote in 1899 when he was living in Philadelphia for an American audience. He wrote it in English. And he wanted to appeal to American values. He was living in the United States. He saw how Americans saw, especially Chinese immigrants, but also Japanese immigrants. And he wanted to say, no, we're not those horrible, we're not those uncivilized Chinese. We are cultured and civilized. Let me prove it to you, and I will explain Japanese culture and character in terms that you will understand and appreciate. And so he translated bushido as chivalry. The very first line of his book is, chivalry is a flower no less indigenous to the soil of Japan than its emblem, the cherry blossom. And it is still alive among us. And he portrayed bushido as chivalry and also as self-discipline or a kind of stoicism. He acknowledged very briefly the difference in treatment of the fair sex, emphasized the bushido ideal of womanhood as preeminently domestic. And of course, that's also appealing to the sort of what American historians called the cult of domesticity in 19th century United States, especially in the Northeast. People valuing, women surrendering and sacrificing to their father and husband and son was a value that he could say existed in Japan that many of his American readers would be very sympathetic with. Okay, they valued that in the United States as well. So he could portray Japan, bushido as chivalry and a form of stoicism to appeal to Americans and say, we're like you. Right? Well, once again, just one person saying everything's the same then provokes a reaction. And when word of Nitobe's book came back to Japan, one person who was particularly incensed was Inoue Tetsujiro, the very prominent, he was the first Japanese-born professor of philosophy at the University of Tokyo. He was the preeminent thinker of the anti-Christian wing of politics, really. He started a whole witch hunt in the early 1890s against Uchimuro Kanso, who happened to be a Christian, who was a principal at a school, and he did not bow down deeply enough. According to Inoue, he did not bow down deeply enough to the portrait of the emperor and the imperial Ritsukofun education, and it started this whole, poor Uchimura was brought up on charges of lèse-majesté and everything else, and Inoue led the charge. And he was virulently anti-Christian, and he also became the most influential thinker about Bushido in the first half of the 20th century. He started speaking and writing about Bushido in 1900, and he continued until his death in 1940, almost his death in 1943. Book after book about Bushido, all these collections. He decided that we don't have a good collection of the writings of Bushido, and so he decided what constituted the writings of Bushido, and he collected them all and published them. So essentially, the vision of Bushido that developed, that became especially strong in the 1930s and 40s in particular, but still is very influential today, sort of the nationalistic version of Bushido as opposed to Nitobe's internationalistic version of Bushido, comes from Inoue. And he also solidified the comparisons to Stoicism and Chivalry, but then discounted them. So, as he wrote, Bushido is the spirit of the Japanese people. It is Japan's special kind of spiritual discipline that has almost no example in foreign countries. In the West, there are things that somewhat resemble Bushido. For instance, in the Greek age, there were the Stoic philosophers. The Stoics practiced self-restraint and often committed suicide. In fact, there were a lot who committed suicide. Why? Because as they aged, they couldn't stand not knowing how much longer they would live. Or they didn't want to get sick and uncomfortable, so it was easier to take their own lives. Because there were a lot of Stoics who committed suicide, the spirit of the Stoic school as a whole generally resembles Bushido. But it absolutely is not the same. Bushido's spirit of action is much stronger than that of the Stoic school, a spirit of perseverance, staying strong through autumn frost and the harsh sun of summer, does not exist in Stoicism. And then he went on, and people often talk about chivalry and knights in the Middle Ages of Europe. Knightly customs had elements that somewhat resembled Bushido. Nevertheless, there was fundamentally something that cannot be reconciled with Bushido. That is, these people, called European knights, arrived at a custom of worshiping womankind. From helping women, the custom of worshiping women naturally arose. But in Bushido, there is nothing at all like this. Not a bit of woman worship. Simply put, seen as a whole, there exists something like chivalry, but it is absolutely not some kind of translation of European knighthood. There are indeed places in which Stoicism and medieval knighthood do resemble Japan's Bushido, but they absolutely cannot be compared. This, and then this is all in underlined, this is because Bushido has developed with a far more severe spirit. Therefore, Bushido is the unique, incomparable product of our nation. And then he continued on to say that Japanese Bushido could now promote the development of the morality of world civilization. So once again, we have a world mission, right? To civilize the world, right? So Inoue's ideas were repeated over and over, especially in the 1930s and 40s during the war in China and World War II. They became very prominent in boosting morale, promoting pride and fighting spirit, and arguing for the superiority of Japan over the Western civilization of the US and Europe. So Bushido came to be seen as the soul of Japan and the Japanese spirit, and the source of a Japanese civilization equal to and indeed superior to the civilization of the West, was actually shaped by this very idea of Western civilization. So before the modern period, samurai thought samurai had thought and acted in many different ways. These people actually existed. So there was the great variety of ideas that, you know, when you have real people, everybody does things differently and values different things, right? So they were known, you know, if people were gonna highlight things among samurai before 1600, they were highlighting, you know, treachery, violence, rape and pillaging, cunningness, zen, tea, court culture, all being important for samurai before 1600. And in the Tokugawa period, people would say that samurai were very interested in, you know, they were part of the bureaucracy and the government. They were interested in etiquette and poetry and luxury. You know, they were the rulers, so that the luxury and the gardens and the swordsmanship and revenge, right? All of these things were part of what might have been called bushido in the Tokugawa period. But by the time you get to the modern period, bushido then becomes this issue of self-discipline, right? Self-discipline and honor and integrity and work and morale, right? And hierarchy and patriarchy. So people began promoting a way of the samurai in the modern period in the mold of Western civilization, because they're using it to come back to to argue that Japan was just as civilized as the West, right? And they're using language that they learned from Western texts, and that was accepted by this new generation of young former samurai or their sons educated in Western texts. Or people reacted against that formulation, but they had also read the same things, they knew the same language, they're using the same kinds of structures to think about it. So even if you're fighting against the whole Western civilization paradigm, to fight against it, you sort of have to use it because you're arguing against it, right? So in the end, they created a bushido for modern Japan that was shaped by the needs of the Sino-Japanese War, so about loyalty and bravery. It was shaped about ideas about Stoicism, about perseverance and self-discipline and reason. And it was shaped both for and against the idea of chivalry, whether it's honor or some kind of moral code, but a lot about male supremacy, so instead of the women part. So they created an image, and the value of Nitobe Inazo, you know, it's in on the 5,000 yen note. They created an image of Japan's warriors of the past that appears both familiar and exotic to a Western audience. And I would say this is part of what makes Bushido so appealing to people in the West. And it's Japan's answer, or at least one of their answers, to Western civilization. Because it's a way of the samurai that's more stoic than Stoicism, and yet, while it's as honorable and ethical as chivalry, but it doesn't have that pesky problem that has to do with women. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot. It was really interesting. It seems like you're saying that there were elements of very appealing characteristics in Japan culture for hundreds of years through Zen Buddhism or martial arts or artistic traditions that value art for art's sake, focus on gardening or whatever for its own sake of being in the flow, that type of thing. But they were never captured by writers throughout the different centuries until they became suddenly embodied in the samurai class as kind of a fiction. It's not that those things didn't exist, but they didn't exist in those administrative officers.
They existed, and they existed. So for instance, the samurai, when they worked as bureaucrats, whether they were warriors during the Civil War period, of those who were prominent and wealthy enough to be able to afford gardens and tea ceremonies and that kind of thing, Or during the Tokugawa period, when most samurai worked as bureaucrats, they had much more time and wherewithal to be able to be in gardens, make and be in gardens, or practice the tea ceremony, or be in poetry groups and that kind of thing. And they did that. They all did. A lot of them, they practiced Zen. They were reading Buddhist texts. Some were devotees of Pure Land Buddhism. So everybody did that stuff. These were prominent practices that people did. But they weren't associated exclusively with samurai, and they weren't associated with some way of the samurai. They were just what rich, powerful people did.
Okay.
And the people who were, a lot of the sort of philosophical ideas we now associate with bushido, they were some of the very many philosophical ideas that the highly educated people talked about with each other, because the highly educated people were mainly bushi, right? And they talked about with each other, but they didn't necessarily, they talked about a lot of other ideas as well, and they didn't necessarily associate it with being something specific to being a bushi. So it's just the ideas, the intellectual world of the time, which we know most about because it was written down by people who happened to be samurai, but it wasn't, this is what it means for me to be a samurai. It's like, this is what it means to be human. And I'm human because I'm Buddhist and human, or I'm ethical and human, or I like gardens and that's part of my humanness. It's not me being a samurai, so it's not like the way of the samurai.
One other question I had too is that 1871 was mentioned during the initial period of creating this lore and mystique. You mentioned a study tour to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if that was occasioned as an invitation to the Chicago Columbian exhibition. Because as I read about that, it was an amazing event in terms of international mixing.
Yes.
There was Swami Vivekananda, who came and was a powerful speaker.
And Daisetsu, Suzuki Daisetsu
Also,
came, yes, and his teacher Shakuso and the Buddhists. So that was in the Chicago World's Parliament of Religion coincided with the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And that's when those guys were coming. So this is about the same time. Yeah, shortly
okay, a
before.
little bit later, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Other questions? I sort of threw the whole fire hose of information at you.
So the samurai were a diverse group of people.
Yes.
And they all had different practices. Was there a martial component to all samurai?
No. Well, sort of. So it was one of the visible markers of being a samurai, in addition to the top knot, was that only samurai were allowed to carry 2 swords. But remember that all the samurai, they lived in different domains. They identify, at least for most of the Tokugawa period, many identified more with their own domains, like Saga domain, or Choshu domain, or Kanagawa, or whatever, under their particular lords. They identified more with their own domains than with samurai from other domains. So in each domain had its own character, and they prided themselves in their own traditions. So the samurai in Satsuma, talked about, they really played up their role in Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea, and their role in fighting and hunting tigers, right? And the samurai in Mito domain really emphasized their role as historians and their pride in writing histories. And so all these different domains, there's different domainal cultures, and then of course the different individual, the reality of human beings actually being samurai is much more diverse than when somebody comes up with an idea of, here's who the samurai were, or what the samurai did. Then it becomes much more coherent because people are only talking about it. And I've forgotten your question.
Rather, there are diverse people with a lot of different things happening in their lives, and but the martial tradition was.
All right.
So were
yes.
they trained? They carried 2 swords. Were they trained to use those 2 swords?
Many of them were trained to use 2 swords. my understanding is that most domainal schools for samurai had sort of an afternoon component in which they learned they trained in swordsmanship. But some samurai, some kids were more interested in that than others. Some were far more interested in reading and the tea ceremony or religion or whatever than they were interested in learning how to fight. And of course, many samurai by the 19th century had become so poor that they couldn't afford to have swords anymore, and they would pawn their sword. And they would have a fake handle and a scabbard and hope that they would never actually be expected to pull out a sword because they didn't have one. And they were just trying to keep up appearances because they were poor. So there was, in theory, a martial component to it. Part of the idea of being a samurai was hearkening back to the age before 1600 when samurai actually fought. And samurai did have the right to, carry out justice against commoners. I mean, were a few instances in which samurai, there are bullies everywhere, right? Who would go and, test out the sharpness of their blade by cutting down a few commoners who got in their way. So, yeah. Variety is the key when you think about real human beings versus ideas. Yeah.
It sounds to me that the Japanese were more civilized than the Western civilization that tried to impose their will upon the Japanese people, like they did with all indigenous people throughout the world. I don't know if you agree with me.
One could make that argument, and in fact, especially if you read, so actually I was just teaching this in class yesterday, and we were reading some writings by Jesuits who came and wrote about their observations of Japanese in the late 1500s and early 1600s. For those of you who've been watching Shogun, or who watched Shogun, that time period. And most of the Jesuits were writing about, how civilized the Japanese are. They bathe. They're polite to each other, right? They're, some were really excited because they adopted Christianity because they managed to convert some people. Others were pissed off because they got kicked out of the country, and so then they were a little bit negative about the Japanese. But, there were certainly around 1600, people were very amazed by the high level of civilization of Japan in comparison to Europe. And then, of course, as you say, how much is colonialism, how civilized is that, and that, I must say that I do have some sympathy with Mikami talking about Western hypocrisy, and they go on and on about law and honor or whatever, and then look what they're doing to us, right? So, yeah.
Don't they have family crests, and you wear those, and those are part of like some of the clothing? Does that come from the samurai tradition somehow, those different divisions into families?
Yes. So among samurai, among peasants, among merchants throughout the Tokugawa period, society was legally organized according to households and villages. So the village headman would, for instance, determine which households would pay how much tax. And inheritance and everything else, it was all your family property, whether you were a samurai or a merchant or whatever, and the family name. So especially among samurai, you often see these elaborate samurai armors that are attributed to the founder of the house, usually around 1600. Usually it's whoever the leader was who got recognized by Tokugawa Ieyasu and therefore gave permission for that warrior to have his own domain. So you often see in museums this beautiful sets of armor that were, in some lords' families, sort of almost not worshipped, but they were highly revered as symbols of the founder of the house. And the idea is that you were supposed to carry on the honor of your house. But that was also the same way for merchant families. Mitsui, Mitsubishi, they had their family property, their family business that had to be carried on. There's the family business of the samurai, the family business of the merchants. Wealthy peasants also had a similar carrying on their last name. Yeah. And a crest to go with it.
The concept of son, I can say the word. Kill yourself,
Mm-hmm.
seppuku.
Mm-hmm.
That comes from bushido actually.
Mm-hmm.
And then personally, I'm having this kill yourself to keep your honor,
Mm-hmm.
loyalty, or it's something to be admired at.
Mm.
And then but in Western society, your life is not exactly, your life is the God life. So there was a big, so killing yourself is immoral in a way, Christian sense. But in Japanese culture, I grew up that time, so I've been here long enough, I realize, but you make it very clear why I have that sense of commit suicide. It's big difference between that's in myself and the rest.
Yes, it's a huge difference, and that was why they were so excited to notice that the Stoics committed suicide, right? I mean, if you don't have this idea that killing yourself is a sin, and they didn't. I mean, there was this, with Buddhism and rebirth and everything, there was a totally different way of thinking about death and dying, right? So there were war tales, a lot of those dramatic stories of suicide that were valued by samurai in the Tokugawa period, they were basing on these fictional tales of wars from the 12th century and the 14th century about these dramatic suicides, because the writers were dramatizing being loyal to one's lord, right? It's unclear how much people actually killed themselves back in the 12th century and the 14th century, and how much of it was part of warrior culture, or how much of it was just fiction. But by the time you got to the Tokugawa period, they took that was definitely reality, right? It was to kill yourself, to commit ritual seppuku, to commit ritual suicide or seppuku, was a privilege of the samurai. So that when a commoner was sentenced to death, they would just be killed. They would be hung, or they would be crucified, or they'd be whatever, but they would just be killed. If a samurai committed a crime and was sentenced to death, they were allowed the privilege of committing ritual suicide, so that they had control over their own death. And that was one of the big privileges that the samurai valued. And so suicide was very much a part of this, being able to have control over your own death was very much part of a sense of privilege and identity among the samurai. And so therefore, finding a way to talk about suicide that was positive was a really big thing. And notice it was Onishi Hajime, a Christian, who was the first to point out the similarities between Stoicism and Bushido. I mean, just think, Japanese Christians in particular had this, especially those who came from samurai backgrounds, had this real tension that they had to deal with. Because they came from a society where suicide was good, they're learning Christianity, they believe Christianity, or they're being taught that suicide is a sin. How can you reconcile the two? And so look, they went back and they found, hey, Stoicism is this ancient Greek philosophy, and at least in the 19th century anyway, the Christian philosophers, the Christian historians of Christianity were like, what became the core of Christian philosophy came from Stoicism, because in Stoicism they found reality and the will of God within themselves, and that's good Protestantism, and therefore, Stoicism is not just the center of Western civilization, but the center of Christian philosophy, and boy was Onishi clearly happy when he noticed that, right? So, it's very interesting, the interactions between these different views of the world, and especially in this late 19th century time. Thank you for bringing that up.
So how did people get chosen to become samurai? did you have to be related to, I mean, was like it a family thing, or?
It's a very good question. So, the main thing was that in 1588, in the 1580s, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi decreed that only samurai could have swords and everybody else, the commoners, had to give up their swords, the main thing was to have an ancestor who was a samurai then, who was a fighter and supporter of Hideyoshi and would be recognized as a samurai. And if you could claim descent from him, then you were a samurai. But so, once you were in the Tokugawa period, being a samurai was hereditary. If you weren't born into it, you weren't. Except by the 19th century, when the merchants became richer than the samurai, and many samurai became and lords became horribly in debt to the merchants, and so a few merchants were able to buy samurai status. But really it was a hereditary thing. But that's, even by the, and that was only between 5 and 10%, depending on the domain of the population, between 3 and 10% of the population in each domain was a samurai.
So when the samurai fell out of favor, the picture that you had where they were clearing the fields, they lost their jobs. It would seem like they would just kind of disappear.
Yes.
Like they didn't have jobs anymore and nobody, I mean, how did they keep going?
They didn't. I mean, not as samurai. So some of them, many of the samurai from the 4 domains that carried out the Meiji Restoration, they got those national bureaucratic jobs. And some of the former Tokugawa samurai also, had connections and were able to get those national jobs. But the other ones, a lot of them just entirely fell out of existence, or, they did something else and hopefully maintained a memory of it. Maybe they kept their old swords that their kids or grandkids then later reclaimed, There's no such thing as official samurai status. Anybody can say, oh, my parents or my grandparents, at this point, anybody can say, my great-great-great-grandparent was a samurai. Nobody's gonna, they might be looked at askance, but nobody's gonna prove otherwise, especially since the government doesn't let people look at old household registries anymore. But, so a lot of people claim samurai descent now. Who knows? Right? Whether they, now you can say anybody was a samurai.
You said it was inherited. Do some of those names, those family names, carry that distinction?
Oh, absolutely, and it's very clear. There are still some, clearly the male lineage descendants of the former daimyo of some former domains. It's, those descendants are still alive and they are still wealthy and they are still very influential in their area, in their local areas.
It's still honored because of the name?
Oh yeah. I mean, the Tokugawa have their own museum, the Yamauchi, they have their own museum. There are some very, very influential, very rich families. And if you go to Tokyo, for instance, I mean, with the changes in the tax laws, it became very expensive to maintain their compounds in Tokyo. And so a bunch of the big parks in Tokyo are the big gardens in Tokyo were the gardens of the former daimyo, who at some point, for tax purposes, found it much more profitable to just give that land to the city as a park than to still have it.
But they are the ones who took Japan to the war.
Yep.
Is there maybe 1 or 2 books in Japanese history and culture that you really like and find to be very approachable for anyone? And do you have any comments of what we should look out for as we watch this new miniseries?
Shogun?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're interested in Shogun and you want a sense of what's historical and not historical, one of my old teachers back in the 70s or early 80s got together a few other colleagues and they wrote a little booklet called Learning from Shogun, and it actually goes through talks about all sorts of stuff in Clavel's novel. And it's long out of print. It is available online. So if you go to columbia.edu and search for Henry Smith, and go to Henry Smith's homepage, you can see on the right-hand side, I think the second thing on the right-hand side is a link to the full text PDF form of Learning from Shogun. So if you're really interested in that miniseries and you want to know what's historical and not, it's really helpful. And then, I mean, there's all sorts of books about Japan that are really accessible. One that's really interesting was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize last year, or a couple years ago, by Amy Stanley, who's a professor at Northwestern University, and it's called Stranger in the Shogun City or something. It's a biography of a woman who was in Edo as it became Tokyo in the mid-19th century. It's fascinating. And that's obviously very accessible because the Pulitzer Prize people like books that are readable, right? And of course, two books that won Pulitzer Prizes much earlier were John Dower's two books. His book, War Without Mercy, which is about wartime propaganda on both the American and the Japanese side. That's fascinating. And also, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, Embracing Defeat, which is about the US occupation of Japan. But, yeah, there's all sorts of things. So if you have any specific topics, come see me afterward. I can give